Good morning and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the questions section on the GoToWebinar menu and we will answer them at the end of each presentation. And this webinar will be recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the May the 29th edition of Crop Talk. As we're getting into the completion of seeding and crop coming up, we're starting to see a few other issues start showing up in the fields, whether it be emergence issues, or one of the big issues that happened this past weekend was a frost event that happened throughout, I guess, the majority of the Southwest here. And with that, I thought it'd be a good idea to maybe get Angela Brackenreed from the Canola Council to come on this morning and talk to us a little bit about assessing frost damage. It's been about 3 days since the event, so we should be seeing the effects fairly clear right about now, and I'm sure Angela will go through a lot of the things we should be checking when we go out and assess our canola crops. After that, I'll do a little bit of a crop update. I'll talk a little bit about frost and some of the other crops, and then some of the other things that we've been seeing out in the field. And that'll conclude this week's crop talk. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Angela, and we'll get started on assessing frost damage in canola.
Alrighty, good morning. Thanks for having me on, Lionel. It's always unfortunate when we have to talk about these things like frost damage, but kind of normal that we see stuff like this happen, at least in some areas across the province, unfortunately. Well, let's see if I can get my slides going here. There we go. So we'll talk about the frost event, talk about damage assessment, the reseeding decision, and then if we can get there, we'll talk a little bit about some other early season scouting things. So canola can withstand some light frost. The typical number is up to -2 degrees Celsius, but definitely we've seen it be able to handle much cooler. It's just going to depend on the duration of the frost, the conditions leading up to and after that event, the soil moisture, residue cover, things like this. Technically, the cotyledon stage is most susceptible. And that 3-4 leaf stage is going to be less susceptible, but that's not always what we see. And I think because early in the spring, after seeding and at emergence, we tend to have some cooler weather, some more adverse conditions, and we do see that plant hardens off or acclimatizes fairly well. And being that those little cotyledons are pretty close to the ground, we may be benefiting a bit from the heat from the ground. So we'll just look here. The province does a really nice job of these emails when a frost event happens. And you can see how cold it got in different regions and for how long it was below zero. So I've just highlighted here some of the areas that to me looked like a bit of a concern. Anything below that -2, you start to worry that maybe you would have seen some damage, especially when you can see that the durations were fairly long, up to 9 hours here in some of these areas. That's really, though, it doesn't tell you the whole story because it's 9 hours below zero. So it doesn't necessarily mean, and most likely does not mean, that it was 9 hours at -2.4. Oakburn, Pearson, Reston area, also some concerning temperatures. All these other temperatures of just below zero and right around -1, not as concerning, but of course we want to be watching and looking at these areas as well. So this was on Sunday night up in the Northwest, and we're just looking at the Southwest here for the purpose of this webinar, but up in the Northwest, it got fairly cold on Saturday night as well. I know pretty close to -5 for a significant period of time. Fortunately, up in that area, there'd be less canola that's emerged. And I know the interlake got quite cool too, and same situation for there. So sometimes we get lucky. Canola really isn't as wimpy as you'd think. So some of those temperatures look a little scary, but we've certainly seen examples in year after year of canola withstanding some pretty cool, some pretty adverse conditions. This was in Lacombe, Alberta, a number of years ago, and they experienced 5 nights in a row of around -3, -4, and that crop survived and fared relatively well. So we don't want to just assume based on those temperatures that we're going to have issues. So we'll look at a few pictures now of what you might expect. So the morning after, and we all probably were out looking at this, you'll see that kind of water soaked, flopped over look. It's a little alarming. Just some different examples of that. This looks a little worse. So you're seeing some white, a little bit of black on one of those cotyledons, and again, that water soaked kind of look. Your standard water soaked look. So you'll see that, but we really don't want to make any assumptions. The final decision needs to happen at least 3 to 4 days later. So as Lionel said, we're kind of at that 3-day period. You know, ideally, if we can, I know this is a little easier said than done, but if we can, we would wait for at least 5 days, because recovery is very common. And we don't want to make assumptions based on that appearance that we were just looking at the next day, unless you're seeing severely black and pinched stems. If it looks like that, there's a really good chance that it's not going to make it. So we want to check multiple sites that are representative of the whole field. And really what we're looking for after these days have gone by is regrowth on a minimum of 2 live plants per square foot. That's what the Canola Council recommends, particularly at this point on the calendar. This is from my colleague, Justine Cornelson. So she had gone out and marked some plants, and this is a really good idea. When you're out looking in your own fields, mark some plants that maybe look healthy, some that look really severe, and some in between, and then go back and look at them over a period of days and see how they're recovering. So this one is just to kind of emphasize that point of not making assumptions. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, that little cotyledon really doesn't look bad to me. And then you can see 4 days after, that same marked plant on the right side here, it's alive, but it looks a lot worse than I really would have expected. And the opposite can also be very true and is often true. As I mentioned, growth should resume around 5 days. This was from my own farm in 2017, fairly severe frost. And you can see, you know, we lost the cotyledons, and we've got green, healthy growth coming from the growing point. So then now and in the next couple of days, the trick is to try to decide, is it dead or alive? So we'll play a little bit of a game here of dead or alive, and you can try to decide when you're looking at these pictures if it's going to make it or not. So really what you're looking for is right at the growing point in between the cotyledons is, are you seeing new green growth? And you're also looking at the stem or hypocotyl for the health of it. So this guy here on the left-hand side is clearly alive, whereas on the right side, this plant is not going to make you constricted hypocotyl there and no green growth coming from that growing point. Same kind of thing here. We've got a couple plants that are certainly not going to make it, and some that are. So lost the cotyledons again entirely, but we've got nice green growth coming. My summer student a few years ago had this neat kind of macro lens for her iPhone, and she took some cool pictures of canola after frost events. This one already had 2 leaves. You can see they've both been lost. Cotyledons are lost. There's flea beetle damage happening as well, but it's pushing out new green growth. So pretty phenomenal, really, what a canola plant can do and make it through. I don't think there's any canola this big yet, but here's an example of what you might see with some more advanced stage canola. We also, when we're out there, should be digging for seed that's yet to emerge. Maybe some of the silver lining of the fact that we've been dry in a lot of the provinces, that there was probably quite a bit of stranded seed and a bit of uneven, non-uniform emergence. We have had some moisture in a lot of areas, so that that seed will still germinate and still grow, and that can certainly help to buffer some of the losses that we had of already emerged plants. Too late for this now, but sometimes these stressful events and frost events can kind of bode well for that plant population buffer. And we know that we can reach pretty exceptional or good yields with low plant populations and fairly low seeding rates. But when we have stresses like this that we're bound to have in any given region and any given year, it is nice to have a few extra plants in the field to help us get through these events. And frost, I find to be so strange. It's very hard to explain things like this, why this little cotyledon is dead and the one directly beside it is completely fine. So quite strange, hard to explain, but you know, certainly you'd be happy that maybe you didn't cut your seeding rates too much in cases like this. So what about other stresses? When we have frost events, there's other stresses that can kind of compound the issue or make it more difficult for that plant to grow through that frost event. So things like deep seeding, if it's coming from particularly deep, it may have more trouble getting through that frost event. If it's particularly dry, if we have also flea beetle feeding happening, which you can see on this picture here. And the other thing is the conditions after. So we know there's proof for what happens when we have cooler conditions before a frost, that we can see that hardening happening. What happens after, not as much proof for, but based on observation, it does seem that if we go from one extreme to the other, it is a little harder for that plant to recover. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we're into right now. But it has been a number of days, so I'm not as concerned. I'd be more concerned if we had that frost event and the next day it was going to be 29 degrees. I would certainly be concerned about that. And we do have some moisture there, which can certainly help those plants. The flea beetle thing, the feeding can compound the issue, but the other thing we need to keep in mind is now we have a plant that has less leaf area and is growing slower, and the flea beetles will certainly take advantage of that. So we really need to be watching these crops closely. Well, watching any of our crops for flea beetles, but particularly if they've had frost damage. So now we get into the decision of, do we reseed it or do we leave it? So something to keep in mind, I know crop insurance has been delaying these decisions, which they should. But keep in mind when they do come out to make their final assessment, is that MASC uses a higher plant population threshold than what the Canola Council typically talks about for this point in the season. So because of that, it's really up to the grower to decide at that point, which, yeah, it's that's a good thing. It gives a control to the grower and gives them the ability to kind of consider other factors when they're looking at that reseed decision. What we're looking at here on this graph is canola yield based on density. So this was a meta-analysis of a lot of different trials. You can see all of the dots are different results from trials. So you're seeing on the left-hand side here is percent of yield of that trial maximum at 100% by density per square meter. So basically what you see is as you're into lower plant stands, you can reach 100% yield potential, but the spread of yields is much bigger. So even down here at 1 plant per square foot or 10 plants per square meter, there was a lot of trials that met that 100% yield potential, but there was quite a few that were more in the 50, 60 and lower range. As we move up in plant density, that range really starts to narrow. And this is part of the reason for Canola Council's recommendation of somewhere in around that 5 to 8 plants per square meter, or 50 to 80 per, or 5 to 8 per square foot, or 50 to 80 per square meter. The point of all of this, though, is what I was talking about, is fairly low plant populations have the ability to reach yield potential. But as we know, there's management implications for that. So we need to consider the calendar date, and at this point, it's really on our side. It is still relatively early. We need to consider if we're leaving a stand, the implications of the uniformity of that stand and how that's going to impact the timing of future operations, things like weed control, and what the current seedbed conditions look like. So when we look at just yield, the trend for most of our crops, this is from MASC, it's getting a little bit old, but the trend for most of our crops is to see yield potential drop as we get later in the spring and into early June, which is, here's on the bottom here, you're seeing the first week of June, second week, third week. So there is a drop off there. Canola doesn't drop nearly as steeply as some of our other crops do. So you look at field pea, it really takes a plunge as we get later. Canola stays a little more steady, and into the second week of June, it's still over 80% yield potential. I would say too that I think producers are seeing or experiencing that this effect isn't or hasn't been as pronounced in the past few years as maybe it once was. There's been, at least in the Southwest, a little bit of a trend of delaying canola seeding into that second, third week of May, or fourth week of May, and seeing some really exceptional yields. So I would say at this point in the game, I don't think we can consider this late. And if there's good seedbed moisture there's still the potential for a really great crop. We talked about the implications of a lower plant stand. We know canola has this great ability to fill space and like I said, still, produce quite well, even in lower plant stands. But what are the implications of that? And do you want to deal with, potentially a little bit more management, a little bit more babysitting of that crop? So you can see a plant like this. That's one plant, amazingly enough, but you can see a plant like that for things like fungicide timing is going to be quite a challenge. This is an aerial view of a crop that had a frost event and some fairly significant flea beetle pressure. The crop was obviously left, but some fairly non-uniform stand, and there would have been implications to this throughout the season. It's always one of those things, though. It's hard to look at fields like this until it starts to flower, and then once it starts flowering, we kind of tend to forget about the sleepless nights we had earlier in the season. So lastly there, and I talked a little bit about this, is seedbed conditions. There were some areas Lionel and I were talking before the webinar started that didn't really get a whole lot of rain out of this past event that we saw, and could still be dealing with some fairly dry field conditions, and that can certainly, or should certainly have an impact on your decision for reseeding. That's all I really have on the frost damage assessment and reseeding. I did want to just quickly talk a little bit about other things we should be scouting for. The first 3 weeks of canola's life is really critical to get it going. And once we can get it to that point, we're really off to the races, generally speaking. So flea beetles is really the big one. I don't probably need to tell you guys that after the years we've been through. If we can get it to the 4-leaf stage, it tends to be able to outpace any feeding at that point. Cutworms, obviously, not as widespread, but always some regional issues with cutworms. Weed control, because of the dry, we haven't had significant weed growth, which is kind of nice in some ways to get the crop going. But now that we've had some moisture, there's certainly going to be weeds coming, and the earlier we can control them, the better. Lastly is checking plant populations. So we recommend that you do a final plant count after 3 weeks, and this is a really great way to inform seeding decisions in the future. If you have no idea what your survival is from field to field or 1 year to the next, it's hard to inform your seeding rate decisions in the future. So start taking some record of this. If you haven't done it before, this is a good year to start. Go out and take some plant counts. I hate to bring back any nightmares from last year, the year before, but we all know there's going to be flea beetles issues this year, and we're already hearing of some across the province. When you're out looking, make sure you're also looking at the stem. We've seen some pretty significant stem feeding, particularly if the weather is kind of adverse. They'll tend to move down below the cotyledons and feed on the stem. And really, as soon as you get through that stem, the plant will most likely not recover from that. Whereas feeding on the cotyledons and on the leaves, we can tolerate up to 50% defoliation before we see a yield loss from it. The action threshold, though, 25% leaf area loss, really to account for the fact that it can increase to 50% in a hurry. Okay, last thing here, just want to promote this canola calculator tool that we have. Actually, there's a few different tools at canolacalculator.ca. But the one that would be useful to you now as you're looking at plant populations and what your survival was the seeding rate calculator. So I think I've got a picture of it here. So basically what you do is you go in and put the density that you're finding, so average density in a few different areas of the field. You put in your seed size in grams, and then the seeding rate that you used, and it will tell you what your average plant survival was. So a really great tool. We can obviously do this math on our own, but it makes it a little easier to just punch it into the calculator. So that was at canolacalculator.ca. And then Canola Watch, this goes out weekly. The Canola Council Agronomy team puts together articles based on what they're seeing in their territories, and we will push them out to particular regions that are experiencing certain issues. You can either sign up for it or just take a look at it at canolawatch.org. And I won't get into cutworms right now because I think I've come to the end of my time here this morning. But if you have any questions about something I didn't talk about or about frost, please ask them. I think there might be a couple minutes left here for questions.
Okay, Laurie, is there any questions for Angela right now?
I don't have any questions at the moment, Lionel.
Okay, Angela, when you're out in the field scouting canola right now and you're seeing it in the cotyledon stage, are you seeing some of the canola kind of have a yellow type halo around the leaf margins? And if you are, can you comment on what that is? Or
Yeah, so that's something that we see most years. So that's from the seed treatment, and it's really not an issue so far as we know, but it has to do with the metabolism of that seed treatment, and generally we see it more with really fast growth, but any kind of stressful growth, you may see that more than usual, but not something to be really concerned about.
okay, the reason I mention that is some people might get, or some, as you're scouting, you might get a little bit confused with frost damage by
Oh, for
seeing
sure,
that.
yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. So it's a really obvious halo on the cotyledons. I should have put a picture in, Lionel. That's a good point. But yeah, so if you are out there, it's not usual for an environmental thing to show something so pattern like, I guess, and this halo is like borders the cotyledons in a heart really obviously. So yeah, not frost damage.
Okay, and I think that was it. I don't want, just one more question is when, okay, if you're going out to scout a field and to just to see the amount of damage or quarter section, how many places would you check on a usual? Would you do 10 spots, whatever?
Yeah, I would try and do at least 10 spots in a field. The nice thing for growers who are scouting is they know their fields quite well, so you can kind of go to those representative areas. And you know, the tricky thing about frost too is it's not like it's uniform across a field, and you can see, you know, worse in low spots or worse on high ground, vice versa. So try and at least hit those areas of the field that are different in their landscape position to get a feel. But 10 spots would be the goal.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on, Angela. That was some really good information. I think a lot of producers out there are concerned and are watching their fields. So I think in general, what I've been seeing is that the majority of those fields are looking like they're coming back. And I've only heard of a couple that might be in a reseed position right now in the Southwest here. But as we continue with the presentation here, I will show a map of where kind of the frost was, and we can kind of go from there. So Lori, if you can get the screen back to me. Okay, so just a bit of a crop update here. I guess we've been talking frost, and that happened on the morning of the 27th. So it occurred in quite a few areas, and like Angela mentioned, there was the length of time, I think, was more concerning than in a lot of places as to how cold it got. A lot of areas were looking at, you know, -3 to I should say about -1 to -3, but they were looking at it for probably, you know, anywhere from 5 to 6 hours. So usually one of the things I always seem to notice is more the duration than how cold it gets sometimes. Seeding across the province here is pretty much nearing completion right now. So the majority of the crop is in. A lot of the crop is up. The cereal crops are up. The peas are up. Canola, as we've been talking, a lot of the earlier seeded canola was up, and that's the concern with the frost. A lot of the soybeans in the western side of the province here are in the ground, so frost wasn't really affecting them. We'll talk a little bit more about soybeans as we get going. We've set up our diamondback moss traps, and right now the numbers are low. Flea beetles, like Angela mentioned, are starting to become an issue, and I think as the next couple of days go by here with the temperatures we're going to be seeing, we could see some real action on their part, and with some areas not receiving as much rainfall, the canola is still growing fairly slowly, so I think those producers in those areas are definitely going to need to be watching. And I think one of the biggest things right now for most of the western side of the province, anyways, is the lack of rainfall, and hay fields and pastures are starting to really show the effects, and guys are starting to turn cattle out, which will definitely bring those pastures down. So where are we compared to other years in seeding? Pretty much right on par to last year, and a little bit ahead of schedule of our 5-year average. And so basically the year shaping up to be very similar to what we were looking at last year for getting the crop in. The chart that I like to put up every week, just showing the different areas in the Southwest and the amount of rainfall we received. Just far right side telling you the areas where we're still definitely below normal for the majority of the Southwest, with only a few areas receiving, only one area receiving 100% of their normal rainfall, but a lot of the areas still in the 50% to less. So definitely showing where the rainfall wasn't quite as or didn't hit as big an area as we were hoping it to hit over the past week. Okay, just to show a little bit about where the frost actually did actually occur, and where we see some of the different areas where damage is probably more noticeable. You can see where the line goes, and anything on the inside of that line in here was above zero, and anything on the outside of that line was below zero. So fairly widespread frost throughout the province. And when you look at the western side of the province, pretty much the entire area was affected a little bit by frost. Levels not as low in some areas, but in some areas where we're getting a fair number of calls. When you look in the kind of the Russell area through Shoal Lake to Manitoba, we're getting some calls through that area, and there's also getting calls from the southern side of the province where we got minus 2.7, minus 1.6 down in the southwest corner sort of the region. So when we're talking frost, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other crops, cereal crops such as wheat, barley, oats. They're not going to really show any effects. If they were at soil levels, are just coming through the ground, or the leaf, you're in now kind of the 1 to 2 leaf stage, anything right at the ground surface. If the temperatures got cold enough, you might get that banding of the leaf, which I mentioned last week. Again, that's something that is fairly common and really not a big issue. The growing point for your cereal crops is still below the ground in most fields, and so really not going to affect them at all. Some things that, and Angela mentioned a few of these, but a few things that are actually helping us out with the frost is we've had some cool and cloudy weather prior to the frost, and they've actually allowed the plants to harden off, and that hardening off is probably one thing that's going to help some of the early seeded canola make it through this, and it makes it a little bit more tolerant for frost. So the areas where we had only -1s to minus the low -2 sort of thing, we might get lucky in those areas because the crop did have some time to harden off with the cool temperatures. The other thing that Angela did mention is that a lot of the crop is kind of just coming through the ground, and even with the cereal crops, and the ground actually doesn't cool off as fast as the air temperature, so the heat from the ground is definitely going to help as well. We did receive some rain before the frost event, so moisture is usually a good thing for keeping the soils, the wetter soil tends to keeps the moisture in a little bit longer and helps the plant that way as well. And I guess one of the biggest things we're seeing is wherever there's lots of trash, we're seeing more damage, and some of the crop was actually under stress conditions before the frost, and I think where we were seeing some of those situations were areas where there was more trash. Regarding peas, they'll be okay. There's usually no major issues. Soybeans, really they tend to be, most of them are below ground, and they tend to be actually a little bit more frost tolerant when they're in the early stages of growth, or the smallest soybean plant is more frost tolerant than a bigger plant. So I would say 100% of the crop, at least in the Southwest here, was either just coming through the ground or still in the ground. So I don't think there's going to be any issues, or we'll see any issues with the soybean crop. Got a few calls regarding spraying, and a lot of the questions were, how long should I wait before I go out there? And again, I don't think the frost was severe enough to really cause too much concern regarding spraying. If you have to go out and spray regarding crop that will be coming through the ground any day, I wouldn't have held off too long. Probably in most areas, if you had 6 hours of decent weather, of heat, those weeds would be actively growing again. Areas that got hit pretty hard with frost, probably 24 hours would be better to wait before spraying, and I think a lot of producers were doing that. I know I talked to quite a few guys yesterday that were just sprayers were just starting to go out again. Last night, the wind went down and it was a fairly calm evening. I know there was a few guys going. So, and in areas where there was a heavy frost for a long period of time, they do say up to 48 hours. Again, the decision is probably made as to when you think that crop is going to be coming through the ground. Very little in-crop spraying happening yet besides winter wheat. And regarding winter wheat, definitely seeing some issues with the cool temperatures. The amount of frost we've had, or the days where the winter wheat has been experiencing frost, plus this latest frost here, is definitely affecting its growth. We're seeing a lot shorter crop right now in most areas, and not as vigorous a crop. We're seeing, from what I've been out in some of the fields, I don't see it tillering as much. I definitely see a shorter plant this year, and it's definitely going to probably turn into a yield issue a little bit later on as the crop starts to develop. I mentioned before that we're seeing some other issues in the field, and I've been out in a few fields over the last couple of days here where we're seeing slow germination of crop. And a lot of the fields that I've been in were fields that were sowing probably that last week of April, first week of May. And what we're seeing in a lot of those cases is we're seeing very sporadic germination throughout the field. It looks like the low areas or low-lying areas where there was some moisture, we can definitely row the crop a lot better. But we're also seeing areas, flat areas or hillside areas, where we're seeing germination similar to this picture here, where you've got crop that's up in the 2 to 3 leaf stage, and then areas where there's nothing or even just coming through the ground. The recent rainfall is definitely going to help this a bit, because a lot of that seed was sitting in dry conditions and just not germinating. But we're also seeing some of the wheat that, as you dig down deeper in the ground, finding it had germinated. There's a root and a small shoot on it, but it's starting to rot right now. And I think a lot of the issues is it was just in the ground for too long of a period of time. And cold spring equals a cold soil. You throw in a combination of dry conditions where that seed, if didn't have enough moisture to fully germinate. In some cases, it looks like some of the seed was able to take on enough moisture to get puffy, but really hasn't done much since. Really affected some of that. Anybody that didn't seed treat, I think, is probably seeing issues a little bit more than guys that did seed treat. And seed quality in some of those cases where was in one field, for one example anyways, where a producer had used his own seed, which is not an issue, but hadn't done a germination test on it. So you're wondering, and now the next question you run into is germination and vigor on some of that seed. And vigor is probably one of the things that is going to be critical for some of these plants as we go on. The other thing is the zero till, and I mentioned that a little bit on the previous slide, where we're seeing more trash this year. Any of the fields where I seem to be finding more of the problem is in fields where it was, zero till for sure, minimum till probably, but more of the fields were zero till. So lots of trash cover, soil stayed cold for a longer period of time. I go out to fields where guys did a sulfured or a harrowing to move the straw around before they went in and seeded or the crop, and we're seeing a lot of those crops coming through the ground a lot more even, and germination a lot better. So again, the more trash, the soil stayed colder, and again, more effects on the germination. So what do we do with these fields? I think we need to keep a close eye on them. There are some areas where some of the fields right now aren't looking great, but this recent rainfall we got is going to help some of that seed that was sitting in dry conditions. I would say, definitely mark the fields here that aren't up, keep a close eye on them, and we're going to have to be making a decision on them probably in the next, week, I would say, whether we go in and have to make a reseeding decision or we leave them. But either way, those fields are going to need to be monitored closely, probably throughout the growing season here. Another few things that we're seeing out in the field while we're out there scouting. One thing you'll see fairly common in wheat, and this was sent to me the other day, this picture, and you can see the holes in the leaves, and you can see where they're almost identical across from each other. When the leaf comes through the ground, it's curled up like this. You can see how it's curled, and if you get a thrip on the leaf, it'll do damage when it's curled, and then as the leaf uncurls, you get these holes that are very patterned, like as the leaf starts to grow. Not an issue, just something that happens out there. So basically, the plants easily outgrow, and sometimes if the damage is done severe enough, you'll see where the leaf will actually break in these areas. Wind events like yesterday afternoon when it got fairly windy, sometimes these are weak spots on your plant, and they'll tend to break right across, and you can lose that part of the leaf. But as I mentioned earlier, the growing point is still below the ground, so new growth is going to happen, and it's not going to be an issue as we go on. Very similar to the banding I mentioned earlier on and last week. So something that happens pretty much on a seasonal basis, and nothing to be too concerned about. Just wanted to mention that today in Brandon at 1 o'clock is their wheat seeding identification day. So for those of us out there that still want to get a refresher on wheat ID, there's still an opportunity to take the day in. It's at the Cinnabon College on the North Hill, and it starts at 1 and goes till 3:30. So there's a good opportunity to get a good refresher course before we get into spraying season. Weed guides still available. Some of the offices are starting to run a little tight on them, so if you're needing a weed guide for this coming spraying season, still available, so make sure you come out and grab one. The seasonal crop reports are up. All the weather station information that Angela mentioned and showed today in her presentation are available on the website. So great information to give you up to date as we get into spraying season, especially. Those weather stations give you up to date wind, and which is important as we get into spraying for weeds here. So definitely keep those in mind as you get out there and doing some spraying. Also, Crop Chatter has some good information on the effects of spring crop frost on spring crops as they emerge. So if you want some extra information, take a look there. Our staff in Manitoba that is there to help you if you have questions. Here's their contact information. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact any of these people. And join us next week as we probably are going to be dealing with some spraying issues as we get into the crop advancing here. So thanks for attending, and we'll see you next week.